In this presentation, we'll be reviewing characteristics, ecology, and diversity of seabirds. So seabirds are birds that rely on the ocean or coastal habitats for food, and it largely consists of birds that can spend a certain amount of their time of their lives in or above the coastal or open ocean waters. They're part of the kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, and class Aves. Now, these seabirds are adapted for the marine environment, and out of about 9,000 bird species, only 350 are true seabirds. They do share a lot of characteristics with bird species, obviously, but do have certain adaptations that allow them to specialize in this particular lifestyle. So internally, some of the, largely a lot of the characteristics are the same with respect to the fact that they are vertebrate organisms, they're advanced, they have the capability of regulating their internal body temperature. They are going to have hollow bones in order to allow for flight, and largely a lot of their internal anatomy is going to be the same. They also are going to utilize or reproduce by use of something called an embryonic egg. An embryonic egg is going to have this hard shell to it, which internally is going to consist of a yolk that is attached to the embryo. It's going to be surrounded by, in addition to those nutrients, it'll be surrounded by something called the chorion, which allows for gas exchange with the embryo and the outside environment. That kind of casing or substance is actually surrounded by something called albumin, which is a protein and contains a lot of water. This not only supports the embryo and protects it, but also allows for water exchange, or gives it the potential for accessing water as well. So these embryonic eggs arose with the development of reptiles, and because birds are related or kind of an offshoot branch of it in their class Aves, then they also share this characteristic. Now, these embryonic eggs are going to be really important for allowing these organisms to reproduce effectively, and they do have parental care that is associated with these eggs. They also have a variety of feathers that are quite similar to other eggs, including contour feathers, as well as down and other structured feathers that make up their body. Now, their adaptations that kind of differentiate them from other birds are going to consist of several different things. First, it has to do with some of the external elements or components to these animals, but also internally they are able to regulate water and retain water in a slightly different way as well, and deal with salt. So let's first look at their feet and their feathers. Seabirds are going to have these webbed feet to them, so the true seabirds are going to have webbed feet. This allows them to not only swim, but take off from the water surface so they can rest on the water surface. It also is going to, these webbed feet are also going to have claws associated with them so that they are able to kind of capture their prey a little bit easier. Now, not all seabirds, or birds that are associated with the sea, I should say, or coastal environments are going to have this, but this is for those true seabirds that are found, that spend a lot of their time in some of these open ocean waters. They additionally have some unique feather features to them. So while all birds are going to have down feathers, which provide warmth for the animals and allow them to kind of retain their body heat, the contour and flight feathers of seabirds are going to have powder on them that helps to repel water. They also are going to produce oil that allows them to spread that oil all over their powdered feathers. That process of preening, where they kind of dip their head into their body and spread it around their feathers, is going to be a useful tactic for allowing them to place this water-resistant topical substance on their feathers. And the combination of the powdered feathers, powder feathers and the oil is going to be useful for helping to repel water. They also have a great diversity in terms of their beak adaptations. So the adaptations associated with each beak is going to be specific to the type of fish they're going to capture. So it's why there's such a great diversity. And we kind of see this in a lot of different species of birds that are similar. If they specialize in some type feeding on some type of bug that lives within a flower versus along the stems, then they're going to have a different beak structure or adaptation that makes them successful. So the beak structure is really largely important in birds in allowing them to be able to, survive. And we find that in seabirds, there's a few unique structures. The pelican is going to have a beak that acts as a scoop, so it's got some tissue associated with it that allows them to kind of scoop up their fish. The albatross is going to have a hooked beak that allows them to grip their prey. So they have a little hook on it to enable them to get the fish. And puffins are going to have a large beak, which helps them to hold more fish. They also have this raspy little tongue, and the little spines along the pellet help them to capture more prey. So it's interesting kind of adaptation, and I'm sure you guys have seen the picture on the bottom right-hand side before, with puffins capturing quite a few of these little fish within their beaks. Very effective structure. Wing modification is another important element. The wings of, there's two types of wings, really, a couple different types. One is the short and stubby kind of wings. These are going to be useful for short flights and for diving underwater, such as in the marbled murrelet that's in the top picture there. Then you have birds that are going to have long, slim wings. These, as in the Laysan albatross over to the right-hand side, these wings are going to be useful for long-distance flying to help them find scattered prey at the surface. So definitely some different strategies in terms of prey capture that are corresponding to those different wing structures. They also have counter shading, which is a form of camouflage. If you take a look at the Max shearwater in the bottom right-hand corner, you see that there's white on the underside of the wings and then a dark on the top of the wings. That makes it such that if something is looking up at the surface where there's light, the bird will blend in and will not be seen easily, whereas if the bird is diving down and a fish is looking down, the top is dark and will blend in with the dark waters. So a very common thing we see in marine organism is that counter shading or form of camouflage. So living within a saltwater environment can obviously cause a lot of different issues, as you can imagine. So one way that they counteract the issue of salt, because the salty environments are going to have a different concentration of salt than the internal environment of these birds. So the first thing they can do is eliminate salt from their bodies using a salt gland. This salt gland is going to be located on the head of the organism, and it's actually going to secrete salt out of the body of the animal via this little pore out of the nostril there. So there's a salt gland, and then there's ducts associated with it, and salt gets secreted directly out of the bird in that way. As you can see in the figure in the bottom there, the location of that salt gland is going to vary as well for various types of birds. This salt gland is actually a specific form of osmoregulation. It helps them maintain their internal salt concentrations and not get them, increase them when they are able, which enables them to be able to drink seawater. So if they were to drink seawater and not have this salt gland, then all that salt would mess up their internal salt concentrations and would probably lead to the death of the organism or the bird. So this salt gland enables them to actually drink the seawater and maintain the water in their system and excrete the salt element. There's also a reduction of water loss that occurs, or conservation of water really, that occurs through their excretion. They excrete something called uric acid which is a concentrated form of urine. This uric acid is similar to purines that are found in nucleic acid, so it's has that structure off to the right-hand side. And as you can see in the picture there, we often refer to bird excrement as guano. It's kind of the term that's used for it oftentimes, and it has this white coloration to it, or more of a concentrated structure to it. So I'm sure we've all seen excrement from birds before, and it's going to be limited in terms of the water that's incorporated in that excrement. We see some evidence of convergent evolution in birds, and essentially with convergent evolution, the idea is that there are structures that are similar between different birds that arise because of the function associated with those structures, and not necessarily because of the fact that they have a common ancestor. So a great example is a bat and a wing, a wing on a bat and a wing on a bird. A bat is a mammal, a bird is a bird, and they have very different ancestors and very different evolutionary paths. However, they still have a similar structure to them. That structure, which we call analogous structures, did not arise because of a most recent common ancestor. They didn't come from the same ancestor and then develop a whole new metabolism system and way of reproduction. It's more that they were able, the adaptation of the wing arose out of some environmental pressure or some other kind of, need of the organism. And over time, that evolutionary structure evolved in both of them. So in birds, we see this too. For example, we have a horned puffin over on the left-hand side and a gentoo penguin over on the right-hand side. They have similarities in terms of a lot of their characteristics. However, they both have these flipper-like wings that help them to swim and dense overlapping feathers that help with insulation and waterproofing when they're in the water, when they're underwater. That webbed footing as well is another structure that's, it's found in a lot of birds, seabirds, so I guess it's a bit different. But they have very different evolutionary relationships with other birds. So those characteristics are more due to the fact that they both require going underwater and swimming in order to capture their food. It's not necessarily because they have a common ancestor. Obviously, they're all birds, but we're talking about that most recent common ancestor in the phylogenetic tree. So, looking a little bit at the diversity of seabirds, there is, as we mentioned, approximately 350 types of seabirds. They span the globe and are largely concentrated in the upper and lower latitudes of the Earth. That variability in these species is going to be, unique for some species. For instance, we only find penguins in the southern hemisphere. We don't find them in the northern hemisphere. So there is a bit of variability in terms of kind of the restricted habitat for some of these birds. However, others can be located in, at least subspecies of others can be located in both northern and southern latitudes. This map gives you an idea of the seabird diversity, kind of the concentration of where that diversity exists. And you can see that in this map, the red color is going to represent a very high number of bird species. And the green is going to represent, on the lower end of the scale, is going to represent a lower number of seabird species. So all of the green area, the red area where there's a high number of bird species is actually, concentrated in just off of Australia and within the center or the island region, really, of the Pacific. In the Indian Ocean as well as the Atlantic Ocean, we see there's less of a diversity, with the exception of within the lower latitudes of the Atlantic Ocean. And then obviously there's quite a bit lower, as you get to the extremities of the northern latitudes and the southern latitudes, we find that diversity goes down as well. If we compare that to threatened species, we see that the similar pattern exists in that there is the greatest diversity or the greatest amount of birds, diversity of birds is going to be occurring in that, just off of Australia in that New Zealand region. So ecologically, birds are going to have a different type of life history from land birds. Seabirds are going to have different life history from land birds. They are going to be K-selected species generally, which is slightly different. There's more R-selected species of terrestrial or land birds. But K-selected species are going to live a little bit longer. They'll live between 20 and 60 years. They delay their breeding because of the fact that they live longer. So their breeding doesn't start till a 5 to 10 year period. And then they invest more in fewer young. So they have a longer period of time where they care for their young, unlike, your common backyard bird species that you've observed that only spend, have a very short time with their young in the nest. The other interesting thing about them is that they breed less frequently on shore. 95% of seabirds are what we call colonial, so they are going to exist in these dense packs along cliffs or on islands or headlands, such as in the figure off to the left-hand side. After they're done breeding in these big old packs, they migrate to feeding grounds. Feeding is going to be diverse, but as you can imagine, largely they are going to feed on small fish. They also can eat krill or squid and egg masses and drifting garbage. Unfortunately, that last one is quite common, which we'll touch on in a second. But their feeding strategies are, well adapted for fish, particularly those that are going to be closer to the surface. And the feeding strategies they kind of enlist are going to be species dependent. Some of them can do this deep plunging approach where they have get really high up and then dive deep into the water there after getting a little bit of momentum. There's surface scavenging where birds just kind of hang out along the surface and then dip down when they come across some fish. They can steal from other birds. It's another, unfortunate for the original bird, way of acquiring food. Dip feeding is where they just kind of have shallow dives. And then there's underwater pursuits. So species like puffins and penguins can do this swimming, use their wings for swimming purposes and catch their food that way. Unfortunately, though, another thing that birds have been found to prefer, unfortunately, is plastic. And we've all heard a lot about plastic in the oceans, but it's having a pretty big devastating effect on seabirds. Currently, it's estimated that 90% of birds have ingested plastic, and even if they haven't digested big chunks of plastic like this, there's plastic within fish that they could have ingested. Plastic debris causes the death of more than 1 million seabirds each year because of the fact that it fills up in their stomach and they feel full and then they don't eat food and don't get nutrients and they can't live. So it's quite a devastating problem for these species. Bycatch of seabirds is another common way or problem for these organisms, for these animals. So bycatch is where basically birds are caught on fishing lines or in fishing nets, and they're the unintended catch of that. So the fishing lines are put out for something else, but unfortunately birds find themselves either attached to longline fisheries, which causes which is at the top there, and causes a mortality of about at least 300,000 birds per year. And then the gillnet fisheries, which is in the bottom left-hand side and causes closer to 400,000 deaths per year. There's also trawl net fisheries that can cause the death of birds, but that's a much lower rate. And those are just smaller short-term release nets, which is probably why there's less of an impact. But it is a serious problem for these animals, and one that conservationists try to find ways for them to avoid through different structures on the gill net or warning systems and things like that. So seabirds are, because of these two large topics, in addition to things like pollution and whatnot, like oil slicks, things along those lines. At least in the UK, there was a report that seabirds are in crisis. I don't know if this actually applies. Oh yeah, this is actually by country. So it's more of a global kind of assessment as opposed to just in the UK, even though it's produced by the UK. So in this study, you can see that there's a huge problem in the loss of seabirds. We find that obviously New Zealand's a home to a large number of these seabirds. New Zealand and Australia we saw from our maps. And the number of those threatened seabirds are going to be larger in those territories. But we see that over half of the bird species are decreasing in populations. About 2/3 of them are stable, and maybe that's about 40%. 40% are stable, and another 10% or so are increasing. So 50% decreasing, number of species decreasing is pretty big pretty big crisis in terms of a group of species. All right, the other thing to note is that because of the fact that they are plagued by certain conditions, and because they are very important as indicator species for different habitats, marine protected areas really do rely upon seabirds as a means of helping to define the areas that are protected for marine habitats. A marine protected area, or an MPA, in the United States can come in one of several forms. It can either be a marine sanctuary, an estuary. There's ocean parks and marine wildlife refuges. There's also some regions that are, wetland regions and things along those lines. The MPAs can be established to help protect the ecosystem and preserve certain, shipwrecks and archaeological sites and things like that. However, what's interesting is in this study by McGowan et al. In 2013, they used seabird habitat preference to inform marine spatial planning. So they did a survey of marine birds within a region to determine where the highest densities of those birds were, and then in their report here, they put together for the western gull, common murre, Caskin's auklet, rhinoceros auklet, and Brandt's cormorant. They put together an idea of variables that are associated with the higher or the densities of different seabirds. So they took a look at sea surface temperature, climate indices, some bathymetry, so distance to land or distance to the seafloor, and also information on some of the physical characteristics, such as swell height and whatnot within a region. And using all of those different oceanographic variables, as well as seabird counts and bathymetry data, they actually put together a model to predict where there's going to be the highest abundance of those species. And then they put together different scenarios for planning MPAs, wherein 10% of that highest density area was used for defining the marine protected region, 30%, and then 50%. So in this figure here, you can see in scenario 1, which is the first 3 panels on the left-hand side, which is a comparison of the results where it's prioritizing the conservation of seabird habitat alone. And scenario 2, off to the right-hand side, is a scenario where that marine protected area is going to include incorporation of human activities as well, so fishing, recreational use, and this, that, and the other. So you can see that there's quite a bit of a different scenario that's laid out in this 10%, 30% conservation and 50% conservation kind of scenario. It looks a little bit different in terms of what areas would be most critical for protecting the region when you look at just the seabird distribution as well as human activities. So interestingly enough, though, this kind of region within the middle tends to be a big core, as does this little bit over here. So they were only able to determine that those regions should be, considered for marine protected areas because of the fact that they looked at the density of birds in addition to all these other characteristics. So interesting how we can use this information on these important species to control and kind of help to better protect ocean regions. I hope you enjoy this presentation on seabirds.